In this video, we're going to talk about the third analytical approach that we're looking at this week, which is discursive psychology. First, let's look at the two concepts that make up the term discursive psychology. First, of course, is the notion of discourse and the related aspects of discursive practices and discourse analysis. As you know from the introduction to the course, there are differing perspectives to what constitutes discourse and also different views on what constitutes analysis of this discourse. And to some extent, we also see some of these variations in how discursive psychology is understood and applied. The second term is psychology. So, psychology is the noun in the term discursive psychology, and according to the APA, psychology is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. Psychology is a multifaceted discipline and includes many subfields of study such as areas of human development, sports, health, clinical, social behavior, and cognitive processes. In the broader field of psychology, various research methods are used to explore psychological topics and questions, including qualitative and quantitative research approaches. Discursive psychology is distinct in its focus on discourse as the space in which psychological topics are constituted, enacted, and managed, and a comprehensive alternative perspective to more traditional psychological approaches such as psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and social cognitivism. This slide depicts some of the influences of discursive psychology. Discursive psychology is an area within the field of psychology with intersections among sociology and discourse analysis. Like the other approaches we've discussed, DP has been influenced by ethnomethodology in its focus on studying people's behavior in context and observing and recording natural interactions. In addition, some strands of discursive psychology are strongly influenced by CA, with more of an interactional focus and interactional elements being brought into the analysis. And we can see some of the key scholars in this type of discursive psychology are those in the Loughborough School, including Jonathan Potter, Alexa Hepburn, and Margaret Wetherell. To give some context to the development of DP, you can look back into the early days of the field of psychology, and you can read more about this in the Discourse Readers, Angry Miller, the volume that's part of our main course books. And there's an article by Jonathan Potter that describes the early phases of discursive psychology. So earlier on in the social sciences, there were very few people using qualitative approaches, and psychological topics were largely studied through experiments and quantitative methods, maybe surveys, and experiments which were designed to somehow access what goes on in people's minds. But discursive psychology came out of a time when the bottom-up approach to studying human social life was becoming more widely used. And as we have discussed before, how ethnomethodology has influenced approaches like discourse analysis. In the same way, discursive psychology was influenced by the idea that we can study social life not necessarily from the top down, looking at macro structures, but from the bottom up and looking at how people manage and accomplish certain psychological topics or psychological matters like emotions and knowing and epistemic concerns in interaction or in discourse. A brief overview of discursive psychology. Discursive psychology addresses psychological matters in terms of how they figure and how they're enacted and managed in discourse. And this discourse can include conversations, everyday conversations such as family mealtime conversations, or institutional conversations such as therapy sessions. In the assigned reading, Potter describes discursive psychology as a systematic and comprehensive perspective that presents an alternative to traditional psychological approaches such as psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and social cognition. While these approaches in psychology may also use therapeutic interviews and other forms of talk as data, their focus in analysis is often to study the talk as a way of accessing some sort of inner state. In contrast, discursive psychology focuses on how psychological objects, orientations, and displays are part of our discursive practices that appear in everyday and institutional settings. These practices don't just involve the language aspects of talk, but also the interactional aspects and embodied physical actions that accompany them, for example, crying and laughing. In building this approach, Potter and his colleagues have had to present radically different ways of defining the nature of what constitutes psychological aspects of social life. Potter discusses four key principles of discursive psychology. You might already be familiar with some of these principles, as the first three are common underlying assumptions throughout many discourse analytic approaches. Let's go through them. First, discourse is action-oriented. Discourse is conceptualized as a central resource that people use to perform action. Now, this could be actions such as invitations and complaints, which have specific speech act verbs associated with them, and they're easily identifiable as a distinct turn unit. Or the action could be more complex, actions that are not tied to a particular speech act verb. For example, in institutional practices such as patient-centered decision making, which can be performed over question-answer sequences. Secondly, discourse is situated. So we don't approach language and discourse as objects that exist separately from context. Discourse derives meaning within a particular context. We can look at discursive action as being situated within the immediate conversational sequence, as well as in terms of the broader context, for example, the institutional or social context. Third, discourse is constructed and constructive. We all have various resources which we use to construct discourse. We can say that discourse is constructed from these resources, which include words, categories, rhetorical commonplaces, grammatical structures, conversational practices, and so on, all of which may be delivered in real time with prosody, timing, and other interactional features. When talking about written discourse, we can also include resources such as layouts, fonts, and multimodal or visual aspects. On the other hand, discourse is constructive in that we use discourse to build versions of reality and perform actions. Psychological worlds, social organization and action, histories, and broader structures are constructed through discourse. The fourth principle that Potter mentions centers on the psychological focus of DP, that is, discourse is produced as psychological. This refers to the perspective in DP that psychology is a major issue that participants manage through their discourse. Psychology is not seen as a natural object in the world that can be studied on its own apart from its situation context. In general, there are three strands of discursive psychology which reflect the three broad perspectives towards discourse and discourse analysis in general. Firstly, we have the post-structuralist or structuralist strand, which is concerned with psychological matters within the focus on discourse, power, and the subject. In the first strand, the analyst looks at discourse, but as an abstract concept that's not tied to a particular social concept. This strand is more oriented to the bottom-down approach where macro structures and forces are relevant to the analysis. In contrast, the second strand is an interactionist approach to discursive psychology. This strand has its roots in constructivism, which takes a micro or bottom-up approach to understanding social practices and structures. Using tools and concepts from CA and ethnomethodology, this strand is concerned with seeing how participants manage psychological matters in their discursive practices. In the second strand, the analyst is highly focused on the linguistic and interactional aspects of the social action without alluding to how these are linked to broader sociocultural processes and structures. Like interactional social linguistics, the third strand of discursive psychology, termed the synthetic approach, unites the first and second perspective by paying attention to what people do with their text and talk, and on the discursive resources they deploy in these practices, while also including broader macro or larger contextual factors in their analysis. The concept of interpretative repertoire is often used instead of discourse to emphasize that discourses are drawn on in social interaction as flexible resources. So, how does DP deal with psychological states and characteristics? According to Potter, discursive psychology re-specifies standard psychological topics as discourse practices. For example, topics such as memory, scripts, and attitudes are re-examined in terms of how they're managed or performed in discourse. Also, discursive psychology is concerned with how speakers make use of the psychological lexicon, for example, the use of terms that describe feelings such as angry and jealous, and those terms that refer to cognitive or epistemic aspects, for example, I know, I believe, to examine the situated use of the psychological thesaurus. In addition, discursive psychology is concerned with how we manage psychological implications in our discourse. So, an analyst would look at discourse to examine how psychological themes are handled and managed, which may not be explicitly mentioned in terms of using specific psychological terminology. We also look at how psychological matters such as agency, doubt, belief, prejudice, commitment, and so on are built, made available, or counted through the description of actions, events, objects, persons, and settings. Let's look at some of the analytical focal points in discursive psychology. Firstly, we have, as mentioned previously, the explicit and implicit management of psychological themes. An analyst might also look at person and event description, so how characters and events are constructed. Another point that might be looked at is rhetorical organization. This might be related to accountability, how do we justify and blame, and also moral positionings. Another element that we might read about in discursive psychology studies are about script formulations. You can read the weekly reading by Potter to find out more about these points. Some key elements in DP analysis, according to Potter, are listed on this slide. First, of course, is the recording and transcription of discourse. This can include naturally occurring talk, interviews, and focus groups. While the latter two may also be used in qualitative research using other approaches, an interview in DP will not be analyzed to extract content as a way to examine participants' inner states. Instead, the focus is on the discursive practices in managing these topics within the interview. As with CA studies, analysis involves looking initially at the data set to identify key themes and patterns in order to build collections. Discursive psychology researchers often conduct data sessions where they can discuss and build on their analytical observations. Here, candidate cases or standard cases are identified to represent a particular pattern, with deviant cases brought in to confirm or reject analytical assumptions. Like other interactional approaches, the main resource that analysts rely on is the participant's own orientations to a particular turn of talk. This means an analyst would examine the talk that follows the turn they're interested in to see how the recipient responds to it, and what this response can tell us about how the previous talk is understood. In addition, other aspects of CA, such as concepts related to sequential development and interactional features, are drawn on in the analysis. Goodman provides a useful outline on how to do discursive psychology research. First, choose a research question. Goodman cautions that while this step may seem straightforward enough, researchers who are new to discursive psychology might have problems in devising questions that fit DP theory. For example, a researcher might want to measure participants' attitudes, which isn't something that DP tends to engage with. A tip would be to write action-oriented research questions to focus on how participants do something, for example, how antagonistic attitudes are performed in online discourse. Secondly, choose appropriate data to answer the research question. While DP tends to favor naturally occurring interaction, some researchers utilize research interviews and other methods to collect discourse data. Third, generate a corpus of the selected data type, making decisions about the size of the dataset to fit your research aims. Next is transcription of the data. Now this of course depends on the type of data you've chosen and the research focus. If working with textual data, you probably won't need to transcribe it. And even if working with spoken data, the level of detail in your transcription would also depend on your research focus. Once the data is collected and transcribed, an analyst would go through a preliminary reading, reviewing, or listening of the data. Like any form of qualitative analysis, this step is needed to familiarize oneself with the data. In doing DP research, your focus would be on identifying actions that participants are performing through discourse related to the psychological matters that you've identified in your research question. Next, generate results of your findings by collecting extracts that show specific patterns or practices which are relevant to your study. In analysis, you can look at devices used, for example, discursive, interactional, and rhetorical devices used to perform and manage psychological concerns. Other matters of interest are interpretative repertoires, ideological dilemmas, and subject positions and identities. Following this, an analyst would build a case to support his or her findings. It's not enough just to present a collection of extracts, but you need to write detailed descriptions of what is shown in these extracts, what is happening in these extracts, to support the patterns that you've identified in your findings. Finally, write the report, paper, or article. So now that we've covered some key points of discursive psychology, let's look at a few studies that have used this approach. The first one over here is a little bit different from the data that we've seen in our weekly readings, because this one looks at textual materials. So in this study, the researchers looked at the strategies used by LGBTQ plus youth in PowerPoint slides that they've created to educate people about their experiences and their challenges and their perspectives. So here, two strategies are identified by the researchers, claiming experiential expertise and refuting anticipated critique. And we can see the types of data that are shown here to demonstrate these two strategies. This study uses discursive psychology as a way of analyzing and also training chatbots. And this particular chatbot, Cleverbot, is being taught to talk about psychological topics with a human. And you can see one example of the discourse that the researchers have looked at here. And they also considered turn-taking practices and how they were different from human interaction. Here's another study which has used discursive psychology. This research is in the area of addiction studies related to the use or misuse of certain substances. In this study, Melia and colleagues used discursive psychology to examine how people talk about alcohol. He uses spoken discourse as its data and looks at discursive practices that people use in justifying their alcohol consumption. So we've talked a bit about discursive psychology, and now it's time to do some self-learning. You'll be paying attention to the elements of data analysis in discursive psychology. Go back to the readings for the week, Potter's chapter, read the chapter, and then look at the extract on page 114, which shows a father ending a phone call with his daughter. Examine the extract and read Potter's analytical explanation. Then answer the 3 questions on this slide. Here's the extract from Potter, which you will be looking at to answer the 3 questions. You can also find this extract in the weekly reading. So we've come to the end of our video on discursive psychology. If you have any questions, comments, or observations you want to share, type them in the comments below this video in Teams.